The shadow of one man would stretch from a forgotten Georgian town to cover half the globe. Joseph Stalin's ascent led to a reign of absolute control, a dominion built upon engineered starvation and the silence of mass graves. Every voice of opposition was methodically extinguished. After decades of terror, that iron grip finally slipped away, his life ending in the quiet solitude of 1953. It was a lonely conclusion for a ruler whose actions had irrevocably reshaped the world, leaving behind a legacy of fear that would echo for generations. In the shadow of the Caucasus, a boy came into a world of want and violence. Born Ioseb Vissarionovich Djugashvili. On December 18, 1878, in the Georgian town of Gori, his childhood was defined by the grime of poverty and the brutality of his alcoholic father. His deeply religious mother dreamed he might become a priest, but the boy rejected the church as fiercely as he did his father's authority. His expulsion from the Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1899, allegedly for spreading Marxist ideas, marked his true baptism. He plunged into the revolutionary underground, joining Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction and organizing strikes, propaganda, and bank robberies to fund the cause. Multiple arrests and exiles to the frozen silence of Siberia did not break him, they forged him. By 1912, he had adopted a new name, a testament to his hardened will: Stalin, the man of steel. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, he was not a charismatic orator like Trotsky, but his value lay elsewhere, in a quiet, calculating ruthlessness. While others swayed the masses, Stalin worked behind the scenes, writing for the party newspaper, Pravda, and mastering the mechanics of power. This talent found its perfect instrument in 1922, when Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party. The role appeared administrative, a mountain of paperwork and personnel files. Stalin, however, transformed the office into a weapon, meticulously placing loyalists in key positions and weaving a web of information on his rivals through spying and blackmail. As his health collapsed, Lenin grew to fear the apparatus he had helped create and the man at its center. In his final testament, he issued a desperate warning, declaring that Stalin was too rude, too ambitious, and must be removed from his post. But after a series of strokes, Lenin's voice faded, and by January 1924, he was gone. Stalin moved swiftly to ensure the testament was suppressed, its dire premonition buried before it could ever take root. In the hushed corridors of the Kremlin, where power was a currency of whispers, a dangerous new game was already underway. Stalin ensured the dying leader's final warning never reached the ears of the party. Instead, he began a methodical campaign to consolidate his own authority, first forging a temporary alliance with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to methodically sideline Leon Trotsky, the man many believed was Lenin's natural successor. Stripped of his military authority and finally exiled from the Soviet Union entirely in 1929, Trotsky's fall was a stark lesson for any who might dare to challenge the new order. With his chief rival gone, Stalin's gaze fell upon the very men who had helped him. Zinoviev and Kamenev were soon branded with the poison of factionalism and cast out from the party they helped build. Through fabricated charges, public humiliation, and the chilling finality of secret executions, he systematically erased his rivals. By 1928, his control over the Communist Party was absolute, and with it, the Soviet Union itself. From this pinnacle of power, he launched his great ambition, the first 5-year plan. It was a monumental project designed to transform the country from a poor agrarian society into a formidable industrial nation. The plan demanded a furious acceleration in heavy industry, focusing on steel, coal, and machinery. But such a colossal undertaking required complete dominion over the nation's food and its labor. To achieve this, Stalin turned his attention to the vast countryside where millions of lives were about to be irrevocably shattered. He compelled farmers across the Union to surrender their private land, their livestock, and the very tools of their trade. These were the so-called kulaks, smallholders who had often worked the same earth for generations. For the crime of owning slightly more than their neighbors, Stalin branded them as greedy enemies of the state, claiming they stood in the way of progress. It was a cynical justification for the brutality that was to come, as their land was confiscated and they were forced into immense, state-controlled collective farms. Across the vast steppes, a shadow fell upon the land. It arrived not as an order, but as a command that would tear the ancient soul of the countryside apart. The state called it collectivization, but it was an ultimatum with no room for refusal. To resist was to be branded a traitor to the revolution. In defiant desperation, the countryside descended into chaos. Rather than surrender their livestock to the collective, farmers slaughtered their own animals by the thousand, a grim protest echoing through silent villages. As fields that once fed an empire fell fallow, grain production plummeted. The incentive to toil on land that was no longer theirs had vanished. Yet, from the cold corridors of the Kremlin, Stalin saw not a failed policy, but a conspiracy. He pointed his finger not at the system he had created, but at the farmers themselves, accusing them of sabotage and of hoarding grain to starve the state. His response was swift and merciless, a wave of mass arrests, deportations, and summary executions. In the year 1929 alone, over 100,000 people branded as kulaks were shipped to the growing network of forced labor camps. For thousands more, the end came faster, a bullet on the spot, or a slow death in the cattle cars bound for Siberia. Families were shattered, children torn from their parents' arms, as entire villages were hollowed out in the dead of night. This brutal campaign was given a name: dekulakization. It was never merely about economics. It was about absolute, crushing control. There were no trials, no appeals. The label of kulak was a death sentence. And while this war against the peasantry raged, the Soviet state continued its relentless export of grain, shipping food abroad to finance industrial ambition, even as starvation began to stalk its own people. Warnings from local officials who saw the catastrophe unfolding were ignored. When impossible grain quotas went unmet, Red Army brigades were dispatched. They moved through the villages like a plague, raiding homes and emptying barns of the last sacks of flour, the last handfuls of seed. They left behind only silence and the certainty of what was to come. The silence of a coming winter carried a new kind of dread. In the heart of Ukraine, between 1932 and 1933, one of the most calculated famines in human history would unfold. Now known as the Holodomor, this catastrophe was not an accident of nature, but the direct result of Stalin's iron-fisted drive for collectivization and his resolve to shatter the spirit of the Ukrainian people. For centuries, Ukraine had been the breadbasket of the region, its rich black earth a source of deep cultural pride. Its farmers, fiercely independent, saw Stalin's orders not just as a policy change, but as an assault on their very way of life. In his eyes, their refusal to surrender their land and grain was not mere disobedience. It was an act of rebellion that had to be extinguished. Beginning in late 1932, impossibly high grain quotas were levied against Ukrainian villages. When the quotas inevitably went unmet, Soviet enforcers descended. These so-called food requisition brigades moved with a chilling efficiency, tearing through homes, prying up floorboards, and probing walls for any hidden cache of food. Discovery meant a swift execution or a one-way journey to the labor camps. To sanctify this state-sponsored theft, a new decree was issued in August of 1932. It became known as the Law of 5 Years of Grain, a title that belied its brutal intent. Under its authority, anyone, even a starving child, caught taking a handful of grain from a collective field could face 10 years in prison or a firing squad. Desperation itself had been recategorized as a crime against the state. As winter tightened its grip, the landscape of Ukraine transformed into a vast, silent tableau of starvation. Stalin then sealed the republic's borders, turning the entire region into an open-air prison. Roads were blockaded, train travel halted, and any attempt to flee in search of food was met with force. He ensured that no word of the crisis reached the outside world, and that no foreign aid could ever reach the dying. The death toll climbed with terrifying speed. Official estimates placed the number of dead at 3.9 million, though many researchers contend the true figure may exceed 7 million. Entire villages were wiped from the map as families perished one by one. Survivors spoke of eating grass, boiled leather, and the bark from trees. In the deepest pockets of isolation, whispers of the ultimate taboo, cannibalism, began to surface, a testament to the unbearable choices forced upon parents and children. And through it all, Stalin was watching. Regular reports detailed the mounting horrors in the countryside, yet he refused to yield. Instead, he tightened the screws, publicly accusing the starving peasants of being lazy saboteurs and enemies of the people. While Soviet propaganda posters celebrated the triumphs of the 5-year plan, the fields of Ukraine were quietly being erased, one life at a time. A single gunshot would soon echo across the entire Soviet Union, heralding an era of unimaginable fear. In 1934, the popular Leningrad party chief, Sergei Kirov, was assassinated, a man many saw as a potential successor and perhaps a rival to Stalin himself. The murder occurred in the hallway of a government building with a suspicious absence of security. Kirov had recently challenged some of Stalin's policies, and his sudden death provided a perfect pretext. Historians widely believe Stalin either orchestrated the killing or allowed it to happen, swiftly using the event to justify a brutal consolidation of power. In the immediate aftermath, new laws were passed empowering the secret police, the NKVD, to arrest citizens without evidence and execute them without a trial. It was the beginning of the Great Purge. What started quietly soon metastasized, and by 1936, the terror had become a nationwide frenzy. Between 1936 and 1938, over 1.5 million people were arrested. The knock on the door came in the dead of night, often for reasons as trivial as a poorly timed joke or being late to a meeting. Dragged into interrogation cells, victims were broken by starvation, beatings, and psychological torment until they confessed to crimes they never committed. The subsequent trials were hollow spectacles, carefully scripted performances where judges, lawyers, and the accused all played their assigned roles. Many were coerced with threats against their families or with false promises of mercy, only to be shot after signing their confessions. In the year 1937 alone, nearly 400,000 people were executed. Their children were branded enemy offspring, cast into state orphanages or sent to labor camps. The paranoia then turned inward, consuming the very institution meant to defend the state, the Red Army. Stalin ordered the arrest and execution of his most senior commanders, including the brilliant Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. In a matter of months, nearly half of the Army's entire officer corps was eliminated. By the end of 1938, the NKVD had executed an estimated 700,000 people, leaving the Soviet military catastrophically weakened just as the shadow of war fell across Europe. Beyond the reach of public record, millions more simply vanished into a vast and brutal system, many never to be heard from again. For those not facing a firing squad, the destination was the Gulag, a sprawling archipelago of misery administered by Stalin's secret police. This network of forced labor camps was a key instrument of his rule, a tool for silencing any hint of opposition and a dumping ground for anyone deemed an enemy. This bureaucratic machine whose name simply meant main camp administration, stretched across the most desolate corners of the Soviet Union, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the remote wilderness of Siberia. By 1939, its population already exceeded 1.3 million souls. Over the course of Stalin's reign, it is estimated that more than 18 million men, women, and even children would pass through its gates. They were not common criminals, but teachers and doctors, engineers and peasants, snatched from their lives and condemned to a living hell. Within the barbed wire, existence was stripped to its most elemental struggle. Prisoners endured backbreaking labor for 12 to 16 hours a day, mining ore, felling timber, or digging canals with the most primitive of tools. A day's meager food ration, barely enough to sustain life, would be cut further for anyone who failed to meet their impossible work quota. And layered over the hunger and exhaustion was the relentless assault of the elements. In camps like Vorkuta or Kolyma, winter temperatures plunged below -50 degrees Celsius, and frostbite was a daily reality. Here, in the land of permafrost, to fall asleep in the open was to accept a quiet, frozen death. Kolyma itself became known as the land of gold and death, where inmates dug for precious metals as their own lives slipped away. In some years, the death rate there reached a staggering 30%. This was a world without mercy, where women and children were not spared. Women were subjected to routine sexual violence from guards and fellow prisoners, while others were arrested simply for being the wives of condemned men. Pregnant women gave birth in the squalor of the barracks, their infants often perishing within days. For countless families, the bonds of love and loyalty had become a fatal liability. In the tense quiet of late summer 1939, a cynical bargain was struck that would set the world ablaze. Joseph Stalin entered into an agreement with Adolf Hitler, a pact that bore the names of their foreign ministers, Molotov and Ribbentrop. To the world, it was a simple treaty of non-aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But its true purpose lay concealed in a secret protocol, a hidden map for dismembering Eastern Europe. Each dictator had his reasons. Hitler needed to secure his eastern flank before turning his armies toward the west, while Stalin sought precious time to rebuild Soviet military strength. The ink was barely dry when, on September 1st, German forces stormed into Poland, igniting the Second World War. For 17 agonizing days, the world watched. Then, on September 17th, Stalin made his move, sending the Red Army across Poland's eastern border under the false pretext of protecting local populations. It was a cold-blooded seizure of territory, a division of spoils agreed upon with Berlin. Soviet troops swiftly consumed eastern Poland before turning their attention to the Baltic. The independent nations of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were absorbed into the Soviet sphere through rigged elections and the installation of puppet regimes in 1940. But military conquest was merely the prelude to a far deeper terror. In the spring of 1940, in the silence of the Katyn forest and other sites, the NKVD carried out a systematic slaughter. Over 22,000 Polish military officers, intellectuals, and civic leaders, the very heart of a nation's potential resistance, were executed. For decades, Moscow would deny the crime, blaming the Nazis for the mass graves, a lie they would not retract until 1990. With the new territories secured, a vast campaign of deportation began. Between 1939 and 1941, over 1.5 million people were dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Entire families were targeted, arrested for the chillingly vague crime of being socially dangerous, their only offense being their existence. They were herded into cattle cars for a journey into oblivion, packed into suffocating darkness without food, water, or sanitation. They traveled for weeks on end. The very young and the very old were often the first to perish from starvation, disease, or exposure. For those who survived the horrific passage, their destination offered no salvation, Only the barren emptiness of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic, and the grim reality of forced labor. The fragile peace of a summer morning was torn apart by the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. On June 22, 1941, Hitler's betrayal came in the form of Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion that shattered Stalin's calculations. He had willfully ignored a cascade of warnings from British intelligence to his own spies, clinging to the belief that his pact with Germany would hold. As the unprepared Soviet military crumbled, Stalin retreated into a profound, unnerving silence, not even speaking to his people until July 3rd. From this paralysis emerged a new, colder resolve. As the Red Army fell back, Stalin issued a devastating command, a scorched earth policy. Everything of value that could not be moved, food supplies, bridges, railways, and factories, was to be utterly destroyed. Entire villages were torched, leaving behind only ash and ruin for the invaders, but also condemning millions of Soviet civilians to starvation and exposure before the advancing winter. But his wrath was not reserved for the enemy alone. In July of 1942, he imposed a savage discipline on his own troops with the infamous Order No. 227. Retreat without direct authorization was now an act of treason. He created special blocking detachments, positioned behind the front lines with orders to shoot any soldier who tried to flee the battle. In that year alone, over 150,000 Soviet soldiers were executed not by the Germans, but by their own commanders. To Stalin, these were not men, but necessary sacrifices on the altar of victory. As the tide of war finally turned, a deeper shadow fell across the Soviet land. Even as the Red Army clawed back territory from the retreating Germans in 1944, Stalin's suspicion coiled inward, turning against his own people. He leveled accusations of collaboration against entire ethnic groups, condemning them without evidence, without trial. On the 23rd and 24th of February, the order came down. NKVD troops descended upon the villages of the North Caucasus, giving Chechen and Ingush families mere minutes to gather what they could carry. In a storm of organized violence, roughly 500,000 people were herded into unheated cattle cars and shipped east, their homeland emptied in just 2 days. This brutal template was soon applied elsewhere. Later that same year, the Crimean Tatars faced the same fate, with 200,000 deported from their peninsula. The accusation was collaboration, a bitter charge for the many who had bled for the Red Army. Soviet records would later reveal a chilling statistic. Within the first year, nearly half of the deported Tatars, 46%, perished from starvation, disease, and the unforgiving cold. Their homes were given to Russian settlers, their culture all but erased. Victory in 1945 brought no relief from the Kremlin's paranoia. Instead, the repression intensified. Millions of Soviet soldiers who had endured German prisoner of war camps were not welcomed as heroes. They were met with suspicion, branded as traitors, and processed directly from liberation into the gulags. To Stalin, anyone who had existed outside the Soviet sphere was contaminated by Western ideas, and survival itself had become a crime. By 1952, the aging dictator's paranoia found a new, insidious target in an anti-Jewish purge known as the Doctor's Plot. A group of prominent Jewish physicians was accused of a fantastical conspiracy to poison the Soviet leadership. Despite a complete lack of evidence, arrests, torture, and imprisonment followed, sending a fresh wave of anti-Semitic terror across the nation. Historians now believe this was merely a prelude, a test for mass deportations of Soviet Jews. Only his death would halt the final act. In the final hours, a profound and terrible silence fell over the dacha near Moscow. The absolute ruler of a vast empire lay paralyzed from a massive stroke, yet his guards, conditioned by years of terror, were too frightened to enter his private chambers without an invitation. For hours he remained alone, his helplessness a grim mirror of the fear he had instilled in others. When they finally found the courage to breach the threshold, the architect of their world was barely breathing. On the 5th of March, 1953, the man of steel was gone, and an entire nation held its breath. Initially, the state apparatus mourned its creator, enshrining him as a national hero. But this official narrative would soon fracture. Just 3 years later, in a secret session that would shake the communist world, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a speech that methodically dismantled the myth, exposing the monstrous crimes hidden behind the cult of personality. For the Soviet people, it was a devastating revelation, the first official glimpse into the abyss. For the families of his victims, however, the truth arrived far too late. Their loved ones had already been consumed by the execution cellars and the frozen wastes of the Gulag. Though the tyrant was dead, the deep and lasting scars he carved into the soul of the nation would haunt it for generations to come.